The first scream wasn't a voice at all. It was the horse, a sharp, strangled trumpet from the dark of the barn that tore Silas Calder from the thin blanket of sleep and put his boots on the floor before his mind could find words. He seized the Winchester from the peg by the door and shouldered into the blue hour between night and morning. Frost glazed the porch boards. His breath came out like smoke from a shot-up stove. The valley held its breath with him. Something moved in the barn, a quick shape that startled the hens and sent a scatter of straw whispering across the packed earth. Silas slid along the siding, the rifle warm against his cheek, listening. Wind carried the mineral smell of the well, the sour of manure, the faintest sweetness of sage wet with dew. The hawk that roosted in the windmill made a single angry clack. He pulled the latch and swung the door slow. Dawn knifed through the slats in pale bars, turning the dust to drifting constellations. His mare stamped and rolled an eye at him, white-rimmed. A lantern, cold and empty, hung crooked from a nail. And then he saw her, small as a hungry yearling and twice as skittish, wedged behind a hay bale with a burlap satchel clutched to her chest, eyes black and bright and feral. He didn't lower the rifle. "You got a name?" he asked, voice low enough not to spook the stock. No answer, just a shallow, ragged breathing that made the satchel jump against her ribs. Another sound filtered in then, a distant creak, like leather settling after a long ride. Not close, not yet. The kind of sound a man's body remembers from years of watching horizons. Silas felt it in his spine and kept the barrel steady. "You runnin' from something," he said. "Or to it?" She flinched but didn't speak. The left sleeve of her faded dress had ripped at the elbow, fabric stiff with dried mud that wasn't all mud. A dark smear marked the corner of her jaw. Not her blood, he guessed. Wrong color, wrong pattern. The satchel had a wax seal half torn from the flap, stamped with a circle, as if someone had pressed a coin there. Eagle on one side, a wreath on the other. Government? Bank? He filed the image away, as a rancher does the shape of a storm. The mare snorted again. Silas eased the Winchester down and propped it against the stall. He kept one hand visible, palm out, the other lifting slow to the girl's height, the way you'd approach a colt that hadn't decided to trust you. "Ain't here to hurt you," he said. "Ain't here to help you neither, not till I know which is which." She stared like a coyote caught between bolt and bush. Silas noticed her boots, too big by a thumb's width, men's boots with the tops cut down, ragged, the soles worn but not old. Someone had thrown her into a life that didn't fit and hoped the trail would do the mending. "Fine," he said at last. "You can keep your silence. But the light's comin', and with it the day. And the day brings questions. I don't abide questions left to rot." He stepped back, took a stale heel of bread from the tack shelf, set it on a crate with a tin cup, then crossed to the pump. The handle squealed, and the water came up iron cold, smoking in the barn chill. He poured, drank first, old habit, so she could see the water was clean, then set the cup beside the bread and waited. The girl's eyes flicked to the water like a bird seeing sky through a snare. She didn't move. Then, as if some invisible lash had cracked above her head, she slid from behind the bale, keeping the satchel welded to her ribs with one arm, while the other crept for the cup. Her hands were raw where rope had been. Not fresh, but not old. He filed that, too. She drank in small, controlled sips, the way a person does who's learned that greed often earns a slap. The tension in her shoulders didn't ease. Her gaze kept climbing the walls, tracing light leaks, counting exits, settling finally on the loft door with the frayed rope ladder coiled beneath it. She'd already measured this barn before he opened the door. Where from? He tried. North Trail, River Road. She swallowed and pushed a half-crumb back at him, a child's payment for mercy that wasn't quite offered. He let it sit. Silence can be a language when you let it. Wind freshened. From the ridge, a lone crow called until the sound frayed into the cold. Silas felt the weight of the day gathering, chores to start, the milk to pull, the fence line to walk before noon's heat came hard. But none of it pushed past the shape of the problem crouched in his straw. He'd had trouble arrive at his gates before. Cattle thieves cutting wire, drifters with a lean look and a quicker story, fever that licked the herd. This was a different stripe. This had a badge's smell around it. Tin and old tobacco, and men who enjoyed power more than work. "Listen," he said. "Folks out here ask where a body belongs. If you belong nowhere, that's a kind of answer, too. But men who hunt in packs don't like answers they didn't write themselves." She glanced at the barn door as if expecting it to burst and fill with shoulders and mustached mouths. For an instant, the hand gripping the satchel loosened. The flap shifted. The broken wax seal flashed. Under it, Silas saw the corner of a paper ruled with ledger lines and numbers inked in a steady, clerkly hand. A faint smell of lampblack and pressed paper cut through manure and dust. "Bank slip," he murmured. "Payroll? Tally?" Her fingers clamped down. The satchel vanished beneath her elbow again. A ghost of expression, panic first, then a brittle, practiced blank, crossed her face and was gone. He recognized it too well. He'd seen it in men who'd ridden out of bad towns with their lips sealed and their debts unpaid. He almost asked the next question, the one that would make her either a liar or a victim. But a different sound cut the air. Iron shoes striking stone, a far-off pace. Not many, not yet. He stood very still, head turned toward the ridge. The hoofbeats paused, then resumed, as if the riders were listening back. The moral of a morning can set the tone for a season. He could march her into town when the store opened, hand her over to the mouthiest authority with a "found this in my barn," and be done. He could send her back to the road, a speck dwindling into the neatness of "not my business." Or he could take on whatever hunt rumbled out there among the junipers and wear it like a second coat until it tore. He set the thought aside long enough to build an answer his father would recognize. "You can stay 1 hour," he said. "Eat what there is. Warm yourself. After that I walk you as far as the cottonwoods south. If you got kin, you'll point. If you don't, you'll say so, and I'll decide if I'm a fool or a coward." Her throat worked. The first sound she made was a dry, unsteady click, like a gate latch, half frozen. Then she nodded once, a solemn kind of nod, businesslike, a nod that carried a weight no child should know. He took the rifle again and moved to the barn mouth. The dawn had unrolled another shade brighter, frost going silver on the fence wires. The house windows wore a weak gold from the banked stove fire catching. Somewhere far off, someone fired a single shot. Just a rancher scaring coyotes off a carcass, he told himself, and didn't care for the lie. "You ain't from here," he said over his shoulder. "Your boots say stockyard town. Your hair says a river you ain't seen in weeks. Your eyes say you learned to count men as they step into a room." He half smiled without warmth. "I've been wrong a time or two, but not often." The girl stood with her weight on the balls of her feet, ready to bolt, but her face had softened by a hair. She looked at his hands, not his eyes, and that, too, told him something. She'd known men whose eyes lied and hands told the truth. Name, he tried again. Just a short one. I don't need the rest. Her lips parted. The word that came out was a breath, more than a sound. June. He tasted it, a small name, seasonal and temporary. All right, June. He lifted his hat and brought it back down. I'm Silas. A long minute passed. He cut the bread in clean halves and waited while she ate with small, fierce bites. A strand of hair had come loose from its ribbon and stuck to her cheek. She blew it away, stubborn and efficient. The satchel never left her arm. He meant to keep it this simple. 1 hour. Cottonwoods. Decision. But the world rarely cooperates with a man's neat ledger, and the world showed its hand just then. Metal whispered against rock from the ridge. Silas turned his head and saw them. 2 figures first, then a third, riding high and easy, pausing at the crown to survey the valley. The low sun struck something on the leader's chest that flashed once. A sharp wink of light, like a blade, turned edge-on. Silas's mouth went dry. He knew the glint a mile off. Every honest man in 3 counties did. Tin catches morning light like nothing else. He didn't look back at the girl. He didn't need to. He could feel her going smaller behind him, drawing into herself the way frightened animals make themselves into knots. His mare shifted, ears forward, counting riders. "Stay low," he said, and his voice was the one he saved for colts and dying steers and men on the edge of bad choices. "And if trouble speaks, let me answer it." He reached to the wall for the lantern that wasn't lit, lifted it, and set it on the sill, signal enough for a passer-by that the rancher was awake and unafraid. Outside, hooves began their careful descent, the cadence measured, unhurried, certain. A chill breeze threaded the barn and raised the hair on Silas's forearms. The day had barely begun, and already it asked for a shape he hadn't planned. "Speak plain or forever hold your peace," he murmured toward the boots stepping from the ridge, the badge winking, the dust rising. "I'm listening." The riders dropped from view behind the mesquite for a heartbeat, then reappeared lower on the slope, 3 now, then 4, the 4th, leading a riderless horse with a dark bundle, lashed over the saddle. The wind shifted. Silas caught the dry, acrid scent of old blood. He tightened his grip on the Winchester and watched the light flare once more on the leader's chest, bright and hard as a promise. And in the circle of his vision the girl's satchel strap creaked, leather straining, as if the thing inside it were heavy enough to pull the day toward one fate or another. The hoofbeats kept coming. The dawn held its breath. And Silas Calder, who'd planned to be a simple rancher one more day, realized the question wasn't whether trouble would find his door, but what it was planning to call itself when it knocked. The riders never took the yard. They loomed along the ridge like a row of black teeth, studied the valley, then peeled away single file, iron shoes clicking on stone until the sound drained into wind and distance. Silas held still in the barn mouth until the last speck of dust smudged into the morning glare. Only then did he breathe and set the Winchester back against the stall post. Behind him, June unknotted from the shadows, satchel to her ribs, eyes asking questions her mouth refused to risk. He tipped his hat brim up with a thumb so she could read his face. "Scouts," he said, "just sniffin' the wind." She didn't answer. She never did. The girl moved like a whisper you only caught the tail of, putting space between herself and doors, counting windows by reflex, measuring the distance to the ladder, the loft, the low spot behind the water trough where the straw ran deeper. She drank in every angle of the ranch like a map she could fold and hide under her tongue. They went to work because work was the one honest thing a man could count on when the world went bent. Milk first, slow and steady while the cow puffed steam into the chill, then feed, then the pump, then setting out tack to oil in a sun that climbed pale and cold. June took to the chores without prompting, hands quick, a body made of wire and will. She never wasted a step. When the bucket rose heavy with water, she braced it with a knee and shouldered the load. When the henhouse door stuck, she found the sweet spot with a flat palm and coaxed it open without a squeal. Silas watched the way she watched the road. By noon, a skin of heat had burned the frost into nothing, and the sound stage of the valley shifted. Meadowlark nested in the windmill, a distant mallet from the section crew on the rails, a cloud's shadow sliding over the wheat patch like someone laying a cool hand on a fevered brow. Ordinary sounds. They felt wrong now, like a preacher telling a joke at a funeral. At the well, he found himself talking to fill the air she wouldn't. "Fence needs a patch on the north line," he said. "I'll take the mule and wire before supper. You'll stay close to the house." She shook her head once. It wasn't defiance. It was arithmetic. Stay close to the house meant be seen by anyone coming down the lane. Her thumb tapped the satchel's rim, then she pointed to the cottonwoods, drew a small circle in the dust with her shoe. The long route, the blind route. "Fair," he conceded. He handed her a biscuit wrapped in a red square of cloth. "Eat." She ate like a small animal, quick, grateful, protective. A crumb caught at the corner of her mouth. She wiped it with the back of her hand, then froze, eyes cutting toward the road. Hoofbeats again, softer, measured. One rider this time. Silas's chest tightened. He set the biscuit on the wellstone and squinted through the shimmer. Ezra Pike, neighbor from 2 sections over, came ambling down the lane with a sack of salt slung behind his saddle and gossip-riding shotgun in his grin. Silas met him at the porch, body turned just enough to block the view inside. June flowed behind the open door like a shadow poured thin. "Calder," Ezra said, angling his hat brim with 2 fingers. "Got extra salt at the mercantile. Figured you might be running low." "Obliged." Silas took the sack and set it on the porch rail, listening behind Ezra's gab for any tremor of the other thing. He didn't have to wait long. "You hear about what happened down to Greeley's bank?" Ezra leaned in as if the porch had ears. "Ledger gone missing. Sheriff's churned up like a kicked anthill. Says there's a witness in the wind. Little thing, mean quiet. Whole town's hunting for a ghost with 2 legs." Silas felt heat rise under his collar, though the breeze was cool. "Don't keep up with town," he said. "Keeps me friendly with it." Ezra chuckled, then sobered. "Sheriff says the witness is dangerous. Says she's got blood on her that ain't her own. Men get itchy when the law starts talking like that." Silas watched a hawk draft the thermals above the cottonwoods, a dark blade rocking in an invisible hand. "Dangerous," he said, tasting the word. "Dangerous comes in all coats. Sometimes it even carries a star." Ezra's eyes sharpened. "You speakin' philosophy, Silas, or confession?" "I'm speaking fence," Silas replied, with a half-smile that warned off further mining. "North Line's hungry." Ezra clucked his tongue, but he read the dismissal. He turned his horse with a practiced knee and rolled on. "Keep your powder dry," he called over his shoulder, "and if you see any ghosts, tip your hat. Might be they're kinder than the living." Silas stood until the dust settled. Only then did June appear at his elbow, Her eyes flicked door-road door, measuring the edges of the lie he'd just told, and the ones he hadn't yet asked her to let rest. Man has to choose what story he's willing to live with, he said. I can lie to a neighbor easier than bury one. She stared, and for the first time something like heat showed under the ice of her gaze. She tapped the satchel and shook her head hard, the refusal fierce enough to sting. He understood it. She didn't want his ruin on her ledger. Too late, he said gently, soon as you drank from my cup. They fenced in the mile of afternoon that followed. Wire sang when he stretched it. The mule snorted. A soft wind stroked the grass into a single nap. June moved along the posts with pliers too big for her wrist, and a patience most men couldn't buy. Twice she stopped and looked to the ridge, cocking her head like she could hear through the earth. Each time, Silas felt his shoulder muscles coil without meaning to. At the last post, a dry rattle warned them both. A diamondback lay coiled under the scrub, sun painting its scales into coins. June didn't jump. She put a hand on Silas's sleeve and squeezed once. Hold. And then she reached down and set her satchel on the ground between the snake and the toe of her boot. Silas hissed, low. She opened the flap just enough to slide out what he took for a folded scrap of paper. Not paper. The glint was wrong. A small pressed tin disc, circular, no star cut, more like a seal from an account book, pried loose. She set it a foot from the snake and nudged it with a stick. Sun licked it. The snake struck for the flash. June's stick caught its neck, pinning the head, and Silas's boot came down hard behind the jaw. The earth absorbed the last of the rattle's fury. June wiped the tin disc clean on her skirt and slid it back into the satchel with a care that made Silas's throat tighten. That wasn't trinket carrying. That was evidence handling. They dragged the carcass off with a length of wire, left it for the coyotes, and walked home under a sky the color of old tin. In the kitchen, the day leaned long. June set biscuits on the stove lid to warm, poured water into a cracked bowl, and offered him the cloth like a nurse might. Not timid, not servile, businesslike. He cleaned the dust from his hands and watched her hands move in the weak light. Rope scars showed clearer. Now he knew to look. Fresh bruises darkened on the heel of her palm, the size and shape of a grown man's thumb. Girl, he said, soft but with iron under it, if a man put that on you, he's a man I intend to meet upright, not in a church pew. Her chin set. She reached for ash from the stove box and pinched a thin line of it across the table's surface, drawing lightly with her fingertip. A rectangle. A door. A circle for the well. Lines for fence. She marked the ridge with small dashes, hoof prints. Then she marked another set of dashes running along the creek bed, a second route hidden by cottonwoods. She tapped the creek line and raised 3 fingers. 3 men, scouts. Then she drew a small 8-pointed shape, sloppy but unmistakable, and set it atop a stick figure by the road. A star. Silas felt the cold move through him. Laws sniffing the edges, he murmured. Too many angles for comfort. She erased the star with the heel of her hand, as if the very sign offended the wood, then pulled the satchel closer and hesitated. For the first time since he'd found her, she looked younger than the word survivor allowed. Cheeks flushed, lip caught between teeth. She unlatched the flap, slid out a folded sheet, and laid it flat. Columns of numbers in neat Clark's hand. Names, dates, a single signature at the bottom in an arrogant slant he recognized because he'd signed receipts in that same office for 20 years. Sheriff Luther Hale. Silas heard the night arrive against the windows. dry grass ticking, a coyote's far yip like a hinge. His jaw set. That ledger is the reason a badge glinted on my ridge. June nodded once. Her finger found a line written in a different ink, darker, fresher. Beside the sum was a single word, written cramped and hurried, witness. A name after it, half blotted. He leaned in. The letters cleared themselves like a face stepping from fog. June. He tasted iron. So that's what you are to them, a problem to be solved. She lifted her eyes, and for the first time since the barn, gave him a fragment of voice. Only to liars, she whispered. The words came dry as tinder, but they burned. That whisper changed him more than the ledger had. The old choices shuffled themselves into something new. He walked to the cupboard, took down the oiled cloth bundle he hadn't unwrapped since the spring floods, spare cartridges, a short-barreled Colt, a small spyglass, and a length of rawhide already tied into a loop. He set them on the table, one by one, like laying out bread and salt for an unwanted guest. "I ain't lookin' for trouble," he said, voice low, "but I ain't ridin' from it neither." June watched, then reached into her satchel again. This time she pulled a button, plain bone, threaded on black string. She tied it to his spyglass, quick knots, sure fingers. A small charm. A soldier might have called it foolish. Silas had seen foolish things hold men together longer than iron. They slept in shifts that night. He took the first hours by the window, eyes combing the dark for motion that didn't belong. June bedded near the stove, not in the spare room. Too many windows for her math. Each time he checked, she slept with one hand on the satchel, the other on the floorboards, palm flat, like she was listening to the house breathe. Near dawn, a wind came up. It pushed the smoke flat and set the cottonwoods to murmuring. Silas stood and stretched the hours out of his back, then lifted the spyglass and slid to the corner window. Movement on the ridge. Not one rider this time, not scouts, a column. The glass took the distance and pressed it against his eye. Men in dust coats, shotguns across saddles, badges winking cold as sleet. A wagon behind them, on the wagon's rail nailed hard as a brand. A placard with big black letters he could read even at that distance. Warrant. The lead man turned his horse straight down the lane, and as he did, the sun threw a hard blade of light across his chest. The star, there wasn't a trinket. It was law that had decided to call itself hunger. Silas lowered the glass and looked to the stove where June already crouched, lacing her boots with quick, steady hands. She didn't ask if it was time. She knew. Hoofbeats began their careful descent, measured, unhurried, certain, and the ranch, which had spent a day pretending it could remain a quiet place, exhaled that lie into the thin dawn like smoke. By high noon, the valley had turned brittle with heat. Dust hovered over the yard like a veil, and the wind had stopped talking. That was when the riders crested the rise. A knot of men in sun-flashed badges and Sunday black coats, and the ranch fell as silent as the child who'd brought them here. Silas Ward stepped out onto the porch with the careful ease of a man who'd learned not to startle skittish things, horses, cattle, or children who didn't speak. The girl stood in the doorway behind him, small as a shadow, bare feet pressed to the cool plank, eyes fixed on the line of riders like she could shrink herself to a seam between boards and disappear. The horses clattered to a halt. Spurs rang. Leather sighed. At their head sat Sheriff Harlan Pike, a man smithed and tempered by office, crisp mustache, hat brim knife straight, a tin star that flashed like a shard of winter. He took in the porch, the girl, the well bucket, the linen on the line, his jaw set. "Afternoon, Ward." Pike's voice carried with a courthouse echo. "I'll have the child." Flies droned. Somewhere out by the pasture, a hawk kited, its shadow skimming wire and grass. Silas let the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders, the way he'd settle a hay bale, controlled, no wasted motion. "Child's got a name," he said. "A roof, too. You don't know what she is. Girl's hungry and scared." He shifted his stance, boots whispering on the gray wood. "That's what she is." Pike rolled a gloved hand, and his posse fanned out without being told. One to the barn's shadow, one to the bunkhouse, two to the cottonwoods where the creek burned white in the sun. The movement was clean, practiced, men used to the shape of force. "By law," the sheriff went on, "I take custody. By prudence, you stand aside." "By decency," Silas said, "you tell me what charge you're levying against a child who hasn't said a word since she got here." Pike's eyes flicked to the girl. She didn't flinch, didn't blink, only pressed her lips tighter together like she was holding a secret in her mouth and couldn't afford to let even a syllable spill. The wind tugged a thin strand of hair across her cheek. She didn't move it. "Name's Lark," one of the deputies called, too loud, like he was talking at cattle. "That what they're calling you, little magpie?" The girl's throat worked. No sound. Pike's gaze returned to Silas. She came from a burned train. 27 dead. Boxcar torched from the inside. Only survivors were a brakeman who won't stop shaking, and this one. He tapped his badge with 2 fingers. "Brakeman says the child did it." Silas almost laughed. The sound that escaped him wasn't kind. A mite like her. "The brakeman had gunpowder splotched across his cuffs," Pike said. "Soot in his teeth. He could hardly say his own name. But when he could, he said the little one lit a match and never looked away." The sheriff leaned, just enough that the brim of his hat carved Silas's face into light and shadow. "Says she smiled at the fire." Lark's eyes didn't move, but Silas felt the tiniest tremor run through her, like a rabbit feeling a hawk's shadow cross its back. He took half a step, easing himself between her and the men in the yard. Heat throbbed off the dirt. Sweat crawled down the line of his spine and found the waistband of his jeans. A cold finger he ignored. "Who found her?" he asked. Pike's jaw ticked. "My office did, along with a freight bill and a manifest that don't add up. Marshall out of Holbrook wired. He's got questions enough to fill a ledger." His voice lowered, and there's worse than that. Boxcar was carrying army stores, dynamite, blasting caps, lengths of fuse, every crate gone. Which has what to do with a girl who can't bring herself to speak? Outlaw crews like to use a lamb to get a gate open, or a spark to see who'll come running. Pike straightened. Bad men make tools of small things. That's what she is, either the match, or the hand that struck it, or the witness. Silas let the word settle like a brand on hot iron. Pike turned that over behind his eyes, then shook his head. "Witnesses talk. This one," he angled his chin, "this one only stares." From the pasture fence came the clink of wire and the creak of a saddle. Spur Caldwell, the oldest of the hands, had sidled close enough to hear without being seen. Silas felt more than saw him, a knot in the corner of vision, a comfort and a risk. "You think she set your train alight," Silas said, voice low. "Then ask her proper, give her water and quiet, not a ring of pistols." "Don't teach me my office," Pike snapped. The edge of law showed under the polish. You don't hand her over, I take you in for obstruction. You draw steel, I hang you on the courthouse lawn and let the sparrows pick what's left. Lark's fingers had found the back seam of Silas's shirt. They pinched there, steady as a prayer. She smelled faintly of creek water and smoke. He wanted to turn and tell her something a father would tell a daughter, something about the way sunflowers will face east the moment before dawn. But he didn't have a father's right, only a man's duty. "Sheriff," Silas said, soft as rawhide, worn thin, "I'll bind myself to your custody before I let that child ride behind a man who believes a shaking brakeman more than his own eyes." Pike blinked once. Surprise, then calculation. You don't get to swap fates like poker chips. Not swapping. Silas tipped his chin to the yard. Bargaining. He felt Lark's hand fall away. Without touching him, she seemed to fold herself smaller. The porch boards cooled under his boots as a cloud scraped the sun and the whole yard went gray for a breath. Somewhere, far off, thunder spoke like a judge clearing his throat. Pike sighed, as if the whole town of Cedar Falls had been hung from his neck, and he was tired of carrying it. He lifted one finger. The deputy at the cottonwoods walked in a slow circle and came up with something from the creek bank. A tin lunch pail gone black with fire, its lid warped, its wire handle melted into a droop. He held it up. "Found this where the tracks curve," the deputy called. "And this, too." He opened his palm. A small brass disc lay there on the meat of his hand, dull, nicked, stamped with a tiny field of stars. Silas couldn't feel the wind anymore. The brass disc was the size of a quarter, worn by fingers, pierced by a leather thong. He'd seen one once before, years back. A signaler's token, army issue, used by telegraph riders to pass ciphers in the field. Not something a child should happen on. Not by accident. Pike saw the recognition hit. "We pulled 2 more tokens up canyon. If she ain't the match, Ward, she's the tinder. Either way, men will burn for what she knows." He took off his hat and ran a hand through hair the color of iron filings. "I'm giving you a grace I don't hand out much. 10 minutes to pack her things and say your piece. After that, she's mine." Silas felt the old quiver in him, the one that came when a stampede gathered itself, and you had 2 choices, both hell. He thought of choices that couldn't be undone, of graves and names carved into cheap stone, of letters never posted. He thought of what courage cost and what it paid out. 10 minutes, he said. Pike replaced his hat. 10. He turned his horse. Keep it civil. The posse bled into the shade to smoke and mutter. The sun came back out. Flies returned to their work. Silas stepped backward into the crook of the doorway and crouched until he was level with Lark's eyes. He let the quiet fill the space between them until even the flies seemed to listen. "You hear me, kid?" he asked, gentle. "I don't know what you saw. I don't know what you did. I know you're not a weapon." He hesitated. "But it looks like some men might have hung something around your neck that'll get you killed if you don't set it down right." Her gaze flicked to his shirt pocket. He reached in and brought out the folded kerchief she'd clutched the first night. Blue, sun-faded, stitched with crude flowers. Hidden inside, as if it were nothing more than a lucky pebble, lay a second brass token, smaller, cleaner, stamped not with stars but with a number, 47. Silas's chest tightened. The thing was cold as creek stone in his palm. He looked up, beyond the porch, to where Spur Caldwell pretended to inspect a fence staple. Spur's mouth was a thin line, his eyes not meeting Silas's. "You knew," Silas said, and the old hand's shoulders flinched by a spit's width. "Found it in her boot," Spur called, without moving his lips much, talking to the fence more than the man. "Figured you had enough on your plate." Betrayal was a small word. It still fit poorly in Silas's mouth. He closed his fingers over the token until the edges bit. He turned back to Lark. "Listen," he said, soft as falling ash. "You don't have to speak to tell the truth. You can point, you can draw, you can nod." Her eyes moved to the kerchief, then to his palm, then finally to the sheriff's men in the yard. Something sparked there. Fear or resolve, it was hard to tell. Spur took a step, meaning to help or warn, but a deputy's silhouette broke from the bunkhouse corner and blocked him. It was Jory Bell, the youngest, the loudest, hand on pistol, boot heel grinding a dry beetle into the dust. "Time's short, Ward," Jory said. "You make this easy and nobody gets dragged." Silas stood. The porch seemed narrower than it had that morning. "You ever wonder," he asked, "why a thing burns so fast when it's dry, and not at all when it's green?" Jory squinted. "What's that got to do with—" "It's about timing," Silas said, "and water." He raised his voice just enough for Pike to hear. "Sheriff, we'll come in, but you and I ride together. No posse, no chains. Girl sits her horse behind me. You can put your barrel in my back from dawn to depot. I won't twitch. But she doesn't get paraded like a trophy." Pike weighed it, eyes narrow. "You're asking me to trust a man who won't trust me." "I'm asking you to remember you're the law, not a wolf." A long breath. Pike scratched his jaw with a thumbnail. "Two men," he said at last. He pointed at Jory and another deputy near the cottonwoods. "They ride behind. That's my rope." "Done." 5 minutes left, Pike added. "Clock's ticking." Silas turned to gather a canteen and a blanket, but Lark's fingers caught his sleeve. She shook her head. Slowly she lifted both hands and pressed her thumbs to her forefingers, drawing a small circle in the air. Then a line through it. Circle, line, circle, line. He frowned. The motion was deliberate, practiced, the way a trail boss speaks with 2 flicks of a wrist and a tilt of chin. Circle, then line. He looked down at the token again. 47. Stamped neat and small, ringed by a tiny circle, cleaved by a hairline cut. "Cipher," he whispered, "or a map." The girl's eyes brightened, not with joy, but with that hard light a person gets when a terrible choice quits being terrible and just becomes necessary. She slid past him before he could stop her, slim as water cutting around a rock, and stepped out into the sun. Every man in the yard drew a breath. She raised her hands and, with the sheriff and a half-dozen guns on her, traced that same circle and line in the dust at her bare feet. Then she glanced up at Pike, shook her head once and pointed, not at Silas, not at the road east, but past the cottonwoods, toward the dry wash where the creek vanished in summer. The wind came back, like a door swung wide. The hawk screamed. Somewhere under the cottonwoods, something metallic clicked, subtle, mean as a snake's tongue. Silas followed the line of Lark's finger and saw it, a length of half-buried wire glinting in the weeds, running from the shade to a dark scabbed stump on the bank like a fuse, tucked where a man in a hurry might miss it. "Hold!" Pike barked, hand slashing the air. Too late. Jory, impatient and grinning, had already swung down off his horse and planted his boot beside the stump. The ground under the cottonwoods answered with a cough like the first breath of a storm. A thin coil of smoke unzipped the dirt, fast as thought, racing the wire toward the creek bed and toward the cluster of horses stamping in the shade. Silas grabbed Lark and turned, shielding her with his body as the fuse reached its hidden charge. And then the world bloomed white. The wind blew hard from the north, rattling the chinks in the bunkhouse wall and pushing a gray veil of dust across the yard, like smoke drifting from an unseen fire. Jonas Hale stood on his porch with the girl beside him, small as a shadow and twice as quiet. She clutched the tin locket he'd pried off her earlier. He'd meant to clean it, only to find a folded scrap of oil paper hidden in the seam. He hadn't opened it yet. He'd been a man long enough to know that some letters once read could never be unread. Out by the corral, a lantern swung, sending slow halos across the rails. Martha Pike, widow, midwife, and stubborn as mesquite, came limping from the stable with a wet cloth in one hand and an old ledger under her arm. "You said the sheriff called her dangerous," she said, not bothering with greetings as she reached the steps. "Men with titles prefer tidy problems. Children ain't tidy." Jonas nodded, jaw tight. Calder looked like a man who came here to close a book, not start one. Martha's eyes went to the child. The girl watched in the way of fawns, body still, eyes doing all the running. Her dark hair stuck to her cheek, where the wind had salted it, with grit. She held that locket like a rosary. Martha's voice softened. "Can I see your hands, little dove?" The girl worked her fingers open, slow and reluctant. There, at the base of her thumb, the skin bore a puckered crescent scar. Not a brand, not quite. A half-sun, poorly healed. Martha sucked in air. "Half-sun mark," she whispered. "They used it out by Dry Rock 3 winters past. God save us." Jonas felt the world tilt a degree. Dry Rock. He remembered the smoke on the horizon, the whispers after. A church social turned to cinders. A storekeeper shot on his own threshold. No arrests. No witnesses left breathing, folks had said. "Let's move inside," he said. The wind was a gossip. Better to speak where the boards might keep a secret. The kitchen held the day's cold, the smell of coffee gone bitter in the pot, of lye soap drying on the sink board. Dust winked in the lamplight. Jonas eased the girl onto a chair, then set his pocket knife on the table, point turned away. He placed the locket, the ledger, and the oil paper in a neat line, as if order might make the truth kinder. Martha spread the ledger. "Midwives write what the county forgets," she said. "Births, kin, scars that matter. I made entries the night before Dry Rock burned, when a woman came through with a fevered babe. Mother's name, Eloise Hart. Father, unknown. She wore a locket like this one. Asked me to note the mark on the baby's hand. Said the father's men carried the same. I only seen it once before." Martha looked up, her gaze hardening. On Sheriff Calder's wrist, when he was a deputy and too drunk to keep his sleeves rolled down. The room went small around the table. Wind hissed under the door. Jonas reached for the oil paper with a steadiness he didn't feel and unfolded it. Inside, a child's drawing, done in charcoal, rubbed from a stove ash, the lines dark and certain despite a small hand. A scarred wheelhouse, with flames leaping from the roof. A circle with a star in the middle. Badge plain as a sunrise. Next to it a man's face, jaw like a cliff, a slit of a mouth. Beside his eye, a long knife mark. Jonas had seen it that morning when Calder turned his head. An old scar that tugged the eyelid just so. The girl tapped the badge in the drawing, then touched the half-sun on her own hand. She didn't look at Jonas. She watched the lamp flame, as if every answer lived there. "By the saints," Martha breathed. He called her dangerous because she's the one soul left who can point at him without a word. Outside, a horse whickered, Jonas flipped the lamp wick lower by habit, shadows rising up the walls like water lifting in a well. "Martha," he said quietly, "if this is true, I can't take her to town. I can't take her to the law." "You can't take her anywhere Calder's badge opens doors," Martha said. She pulled a cork from a little blue bottle, her hands shaking like leaves. He's always been a man who kept the ledger in his own coat. She held the bottle toward the child. "Willow bark, for the tremors." The girl didn't take it. Instead, she reached across the table and drew the ledger nearer, small fingers leaving dust-smudged crescents on the page. She turned to a blank space, and gripping Jonas's pencil like it might bite, scratched the same star circle once more. Then, hesitation, breath held, she scrawled 4 crooked letters beneath. CALD, the last letter faltered. A broken tale. Her lips had the shape of a name in them, but no sound. Jonas bowed his head. He'd known men like Calder in the war, men who hid their rot under polished buttons, men who needed silence like other men needed whiskey. He looked at the girl, at the ledger, at the drawing that took no lawyer to understand. "You don't get to decide who counts as dangerous, Sheriff," he murmured to the empty air, and his voice felt like iron taken from a cold fire. A weakness passed through Martha. She gripped a chair for balance. "There's more," she said. "Eloise Hart. She wasn't alone that night. Came with a church caravan. The women disappeared after Dry Rock. Folks assumed they went east. But I found a note tucked in my medicine crate weeks later. If he asks for the child, the answer is no." No name signed, only a water stain shaped like a half-sun. Jonas rubbed his brow until sparks popped behind his eyes. Choices lined up like fence posts. Keep the girl and meet Calder's rope. Send her away and live with it. Run and be hunted, earth to sky. He had a talent for quiet, had worn it for years like a second skin, but quiet hadn't saved anyone at Dry Rock. The wind died as if someone had pressed a finger to the world's lips. In the pause, a sound rode in, hoofbeats, 2 sets, not the loose clatter of strangers, but the measured beat of men who owned the road. Jonas reached for the rifle in the corner and worked the lever. The slick click-clack, loud as a gavel. "Back room," he said to the girl. She didn't move. She looked at the door, at the lamplight running cold along the barrel in Jonas's hands, then at Martha. When Martha offered her palm, the girl took it, light as a sparrow. Jonas blew out the lamp, left the room in the grainy blue of moon through cloud. The door thudded once under a knuckle. "Evening, Hale," came a voice he knew too well. Calder's tone wore false neighborliness like a Sunday shirt. "Heard a story that belongs to me is hid under your roof." Jonas stepped to the threshold. The night smelled of rain somewhere far off, of sage scraped open by hooves. Calder sat his horse easy, a second man in the shadow behind him. The sheriff had that same scar, dragging his right eyelid a degree low, giving his gaze a permanent squint, like he was always sighting down something. "You made a bold call today," Jonas said. His voice felt too big in his throat, and not big enough. "Naming a child a threat." Calder's smile showed teeth. "Sometimes a snake ain't dangerous because of its fangs, Hale. It's dangerous because of the eyes that seen where it coiled." "Funny thing," Jonas said. "I always thought danger came from the hand that set the fire." Calder's jaw twitched. The man behind him shifted, leather whispering, a rifle sliding where dusk made it silver. The sheriff tipped his hat back with one finger. "I'm no patient man. Bring me what's mine, or I'll come in and collect." In the dark behind Jonas, A board creaked. Martha, or the girl putting her weight wrong. Calder's eyes flicked past Jonas's shoulder, then returned, colder. Jonas planted his boots. The earth felt solid under him, honest and old. He pictured Dry Rock's church door jammed with bodies. He pictured the half-sun on a baby's hand. He pictured Sarah. The memory came unbidden, his own dead, face bright with a laugh that had lived years in his marrow. He had once folded himself into silence and watched the worst kind of men make use of it. Not tonight. One step toward my threshold, he said, slow and clear, and you'll learn how a quiet man speaks. Calder chuckled. You don't scare me, Hale. I ain't speaking to fear, Jonas said. I'm speaking to cost. Calder's face changed a shade, the small calculation of a man adding columns. For a second, the whole yard held steady as a card balanced on a finger. Then a little hand slid into Jonas's, startling him. The girl had come forward in the blue dark, locket hanging like a tear at her throat. Her fingers were cold and sure, and he felt the tiny bones of them like prayer beads. She stood barely to his hip. Wind lifted her hair, showing the half-sun scar. Calder saw it. For the briefest breath, he flinched. The girl tilted her face up, mouth shaping something that scraped the air like a struck match. No sound at first, only the raw effort of a throat unused to trust. Her eyes didn't leave the sheriff's. Pa, she said. The night broke into pieces. Martha gasped. The horse under Calder danced, skittish, ears pinned. The second rider jerked his rifle up with a curse. Jonas felt the word fall through him like a spent shell, hot enough to burn. Father, not just guilty, bound. The badge and the blood were the same man. Calder leaned out of the saddle, eyes shining mean in the dim. Now that's a miracle, he said, too softly. A tongue found at last. Jonas shifted his weight, thumb easing the hammer back. Half the county might wake at a shot this hour. Half the county might not lift a finger. Either way, there was no fence left to sit. From the ridge above the creek came a new light, 3 lanterns winking to life in sequence, men's silhouettes cresting like black teeth against the sky. Not Calder's pair. Another party had arrived, and one of them carried the straight posture of a circuit judge when he called court from a wagon. "Evening down there," a voice boomed over the yard, formal as a bell. "Sheriff Calder, I've papers to serve and questions needing answers." Jonas didn't lower the rifle. The girl's hand tightened in his. Martha whispered something that sounded like grace. Calder turned his head toward the ridge, then back to Jonas, and smiled the way a wolf does when it decides which throat to take first. Which way would the night break? By noon, the wind had stripped the heat off the valley and left it raw. Sky bleached white, grass heads rattling like bones. The rancher worked in a tight silence, cinching packs, checking the mare's shoes, pretending not to watch the girl sitting on the stoop, with her knees drawn up, hat brim shadowing her eyes. She hadn't made a sound all morning, only kept that little satchel clutched to her chest, as if inside it there was one thing in the world that wouldn't betray her. The first sign of trouble was not the riders, but the paper. It skittered along the road from town like a pale leaf, slammed against the gatepost, and stuck. A handbill, stamped with the sheriff's seal in thick blue wax, writ heavy as a hammer, warrant of seizure, ward of the county, dangerous minor. Beneath, a description, age uncertain, height small, eyes gray as a wolf. The rancher felt his mouth go dry at the official language, the way it turned a child into property. Hoofbeats followed, measured and smug. 7 men came riding across the flats, badges glinting like teeth, rifles socked in their scabbards. The sheriff was in the lead, boots polished to a sermon shine. He reined in by the well and regarded the house as if it owed him money. "Afternoon," he said. "Brought you some ink to go with your conscience." The rancher stepped from the shade and kept his hands where all could see them. The girl didn't move, only tightened her fingers around the satchel till her knuckles whitened. "That paper's a lie," the rancher said. "She's no danger to anyone." The sheriff smiled without warmth. "Law says otherwise, and the law, friend, is what I say it is, till someone meaner tells me different." A dry gust lifted Grit. On cue, 2 deputies dismounted, walked toward the porch. The girl's head came up, swift, feral. No sound, but her eyes landed on the rancher like a thrown rope. "Hold," he said softly to the deputies, to the wind, to his own temper. "You'll not lay a hand on her." "That's so?" The sheriff tipped his hat back. "You took in a stray and found out why she's strayin'. There's a bounty for dead livestock, but not for dead judgment. Step aside, period authentic or not." There were sentences a man could not let pass his door. The rancher planted his boots. "Law's a coat men wear till it fits their sins." A flicker ran over the sheriff's face, annoyance at the poetry of it. He nodded to his men. They spread like oil. One went to the barn, another circled the corral, cutting the horses off. A third stepped onto the porch. The girl slid her satchel open with her thumb. Out came a folded square of oilcloth, then a packet bound with a ragged red ribbon. She stared at the sheriff, then at the rancher, then pressed the packet into the rancher's hand. It felt heavier than paper ought. He untied the ribbon and saw what Part 4 had promised him, but he hadn't been ready to believe. Receipts, ledgers, a judge's seal impressed in crimson wax, and names, rail agents, cattle buyers, a list of children transferred to county care and never seen again. The sheriff's name, clear as daylight, beside 3 of the transfers. Not a whisper, not an accusation. Evidence. The rancher exhaled, low and dangerous. "This why you called her dangerous, Sheriff. Because the truth fits in her hands." The sheriff kept his voice level. "You don't know what those mean." "I know enough," the rancher said, feeling the floor tilt beneath all the years he'd tried to live quiet. "I know which hells men build and what doors they write on them." The deputies moved faster now, emboldened by ceremony. The one on the porch reached for the girl. She slid sideways, and the rancher stepped between, palm up. "Don't." The deputy hesitated half a heartbeat, long enough for the rancher to see he wasn't a monster, only a man who had started swallowing the sheriff's orders and found they tasted like his own thoughts. Then training returned. His hand closed on the girl's forearm. Sun flashed on metal, not a gun, the girl's locket. She snapped it open and thrust it toward the deputy's face. Inside, a tintype, stiff family, hard prairie light, mother, father, a baby, and beside them a man with a badge, smile too bright for the day. The sheriff. The deputy blinked. "What is—" The rancher answered for him. "Proof you're stealing kin, Sheriff, not strays. Kin." The sheriff's jaw tightened. "Enough of this. Seize the minor. If he obstructs, shoot him." It was a clean order in a dirty world. The rancher heard it and felt the shape of the day change. Irreversible was a word that didn't sit well in the mouth. But he tasted it anyway. He could step aside and live with the taste forever. Or he could open that cellar door below the stoop, show the deputies the old crates he'd sworn he'd never touch again. He kicked the stoop board. It levered up with a splintering sigh. "Back," he breathed to the girl, and she moved like smoke, sliding behind him as he reached down and hauled up a wooden case that smelled of oil and storms. The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "Don't do something you can't pray away." "Already done," the rancher said. He set the case on the porch rail and drove his knife through the brass latch. The lid sprang. Inside, a shotgun, 2 carbines, boxes of shells, a coil of tarred fuse, caps, and a stick of powder wrapped in waxed paper, remnants from a younger life when bridges got built the worst way first. "Last chance," the sheriff said. "Hand her over." "Go to hell," the rancher replied, and broke open the shotgun with a click that sounded like a door shutting in the world's face. Everything after moved like weather. The deputy on the porch lunged. The rancher pivoted and shouldered him off into the dust. The second deputy dragged the shotgun as it fired. The right barrel roared into the sky, the left into the trough, geysering water. Horses snorted and danced. Men cursed. The sheriff stayed stone still, a snake counting distance. The rancher shoved the girl toward the kitchen door. "Cellar, now, and bolt it twice." She vanished in a flutter of dust, not even the whisper of a footfall, and he felt a handful of fear unclench in his chest. He had to buy her minutes. Maybe only seconds would do, if a man spent them dear. He rolled off the porch into the shade of the wagon and came up with a carbine. Rifle fire cracked the yard into pieces. A bullet chewed the porch post where his head had been. Splinters stung his cheek. He fired once, clean, not to kill, but to break men's nerve. A deputy's hat spun off and sailed like a crow. Another's rifle leapt from his hands as the rancher stitched a warning shot through the forestock. "Hold your fire," the sheriff bellowed, voice iron. He'd seen enough fights to know when you pressed and when you let a man hang himself. He lowered his pistol, the picture of reason. "You're finished. I'm issuing a proclamation right now, aiding a fugitive ward of the county, discharging firearms at officers. You'll swing." "Maybe," the rancher said, and slid the carbine to the crook of his arm so he could strike a match. He touched flame to the black fuse and fed the hissing serpent under the wagon, where the powder lay snug beside the wheel hub. A little rain of sparks, a whispery sound. He wasn't blowing men, God help him, not that. He was blowing the axle pin and the wheel to send iron and wood screaming across the yard and cut the line between the house and the barn, make a wall of chaos that might pass for mercy. "You light that fuse, and I burn you out with the child inside," the sheriff said, almost kind, almost pitying. "Think about her. Think about smoke." "I'm thinking about smoke," the rancher said. "I'm thinking how it clings to liars." The fuse burned, tasted the powder, and coughed. The wagon leapt like a spooked bull. The wheel exploded into spokes and shards that hissed past the men at the well. Horses screamed. 2 deputies went down, swearing. For 3 long seconds the yard was a thunderclap, and when it cleared, there was a jagged barricade of wreckage strewn between the porch and the men with badges. The sheriff didn't flinch. He lifted his pistol and rested it in the center of the wreckage like a promise. "You think you invented desperate, boy." From the kitchen door came a new sound, the scrape of wood on wood as the girl unbarred something heavy below. Then her small hand appeared, fingers slick with lamp oil, and set a glass bottle on the stoop. Inside, a rag floated like a dead moth. The rancher's heart lurched. She met his eyes through the doorway, calm, steady. She tapped the bottle twice and pointed, first at the sheriff's wagon of kerosene drums sitting in the sun by the corral, then at the dry thatch stacked under the eaves of the bunkhouse. She had read the yard the way a hawk reads currents. Fire as a language. The sheriff followed the line of her finger, and for the first time, a sliver of unease carved his composure. You give that child a match, and you make yourself Cain. Maybe we were born able and you raised the field, the rancher said, barely breathing. He didn't take the bottle. He didn't have to. The girl reached out with remarkable gentleness, like a nurse handling a fevered brow, and plucked the matchbox from the sill, thumbed it open, and drew one stick. The sulfur head glowed a patient yellow. Her face didn't change. Out in the white-hot yard, a hawk cried, and the wind flattened the grass as if pressing the whole valley to the floor. "Look at me," the sheriff said, voice sharpening. "Little miss, look at me. Do you know what fire does to a man? It erases him. He screams till even God can't make the sound stop. You want to hear that? You want to smell it?" She didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on the rancher, and in that look he felt every mile he'd walked to this moment, every fence post, every winter, every quiet refusal that had kept him half alive. He gave the smallest nod a man can give, and still call it consent. "Don't," a deputy blurted, one of the younger ones, sweat shining at his temples. He lowered his gun. "Sheriff, maybe we don't." The sheriff didn't look at him. The sheriff looked at the ragged red ribbon on the porch, at the packet the rancher had slid inside his vest, at the smoke still drifting from the shattered wagon wheel. Calculation darkened his eyes, turned human into ledger. "New terms," he said softly. "You give me the papers, I forget the child. County loses a ward, I lose a problem. That's clean. Nothing about you is clean." The rancher answered, and in that instant chose the kind of man he would be when the sun went down. The girl struck the match. It made a small sound, nothing at all, just a dry kiss. And in the bright noon, the flame was meek as a candle at a bedside. She lifted it toward the bottle's rag. The sheriff's pistol came up, deliberate, perfect, the muzzle black as a well. Somewhere behind the wreckage, a second set of hoofbeats rolled in, fast, hard, official, the kind of rhythm that puts starch in a uniform. A bugle note, peeled thin as tin, then broke. Men shouted. Not the sheriff's men. Different cadence. The rancher heard one phrase fly over the corral fence like a thrown knife. "Federal warrant, stand down." The girl's match hovered a finger's breadth from the rag. The sheriff's pistol sighted and held. The wind leaned, choosing a side, and the flame trembled. Wind knifed through the cut of Dry Fork Canyon and worried the brim of Silas's hat like a persistent hand. It carried the smell of wet granite and old gun smoke, and it carried voices, men fanning out along the rim, iron spurs chiming in restless rhythm. Wren stood beside him on the narrow ledge, sock feet powdered in red dust, her small hand fisted in the tail of his coat. She didn't shake, and she didn't make a sound. She only stared across the gulf at Sheriff Barrow's silhouettes, black as vultures against a whitening sky. Behind Silas, the ledge pinched down to a goat path, and then to nothing. Ahead, the canyon opened into a stone amphitheater, floored by a thread of water glinting between boulders. The only way out was across the spine of a fallen cottonwood wedged between walls 20 feet apart. It flexed when he tested it with his boot, slick with dew, silvered with age. If it broke under a man's weight, there'd be no second try. "Ward," Barrow's voice folded down the rock like thunder off a cliff face. "You're boxed. Send the girl across, hands high. We'll talk about the rest." Silas felt Wren's fingers tense at that word. Girl, not name. He glanced down and she met his eyes, the same color as that thread of water far below. She touched her wrist where the rope scars lived, and then the hollow of her throat where the nickel locket hung, a habit when she was frightened. He could almost hear her speak. With that flurry of signs May had shown him how to read. Not cattle, not property, me. Barrow's men rattled a chorus of rifles as if to underline the offer. Sun pried itself over the canyon lip, turning frost to diamonds on the scrub and throwing long blades of light through dust. Silas stepped forward till his heel kissed the drop. "She stays with me," he said, voice flat. "You want a parley? You climb down like a man." A laughter drifted down. "Listen to the hermit preach," one of the deputies jeered. "Ain't no parley with a kidnapper." Silas didn't look up. He looked at the cottonwood, at the water, at the far shelf of sandstone that might give them a run into shadow if he could buy 10 seconds, maybe 15. He had 4 cartridges left in the Winchester, 2 more in his duster pocket, and a Colt on his hip that hadn't seen oil since spring. Decision settled on him like a saddle he'd known all his life. He crouched to Wren's level. "When I say," he murmured, "you go ahead of me, light as a bird, toes first, hands on the bark, don't look down, eyes at the far wall. You hear?" She studied his mouth, then nodded once. Her face stayed unreadable, pale dust on her cheeks, hair stuck to her temples in dark curls. She pointed with 2 fingers at his chest, then made the downward slash she'd used when the barn went up in Part 5. A reminder that the law had turned from shield to blade. He touched her knuckles. "I remember." Across the way, riders eased their mounts to the lip. The sheriff himself appeared at the center notch, coat open to the badge and the bone-white grips of his revolver. Hat brim cut a knife's-edge shadow over his eyes. "Last call, Ward," he said. "Ferries don't wait forever." Silas called up without heat. "That badge don't make you honest. It just makes your lies louder." A murmur rippled through the line. Barrow smiled like a cut that didn't bleed. "You think this is about truth? I got paper from the circuit judge. Says that orphan's a danger to herself and others. Says any man harboring her is aiding a fugitive. Paper talks louder than you." Wren moved closer until she pressed against Silas's leg. He felt the tremor then, not fear, anger. She tugged off the locket with one clean jerk. The chain broke, and the nickel oval dropped into her palm. She flipped it open and showed him the tiny portrait inside, the same sigil stamped in the corner of the varnished card that was stamped on Barrow's belt keep, a cross with double arms, the top arm shorter than the lower. She touched sigil to sigil, then touched her lips and shook her head. No voice, no choice. Silas had seen the mark before on documents, on a crate of seized rifles that vanished while Barrow's men guarded it, on the wax seal May had found in the sheriff's old ledger. Part 4's rumor returned like a hard slap. The child wasn't dangerous. She was witness. "Move," a deputy shouted, nerves starting to fray. Rocks skittered down the slope. A shooter edged for angle and got greedy, toe slipping. Dust avalanched from under his heel. The canyon answered with echo, and the echo with silence. Silas stood. "Wren," he said softly. "Now." She was already on the log. Quick, a breath of weight. Fingers splayed, the balls of her feet finding bite in the ridges. The cottonwood bowed and creaked. Wind leaned, the world tipped a hair. Silas kept his body between her and the muzzles above, arms out for balance, eyes fixed on the far shelf. Halfway across, a hawk cut the light with a long, lazy glide. Shadow passed over her, and for an instant she seemed to vanish into it. A shot cracked. Bark spat. The log rang under the impact like a wet drum. Wren didn't flinch. She just moved faster, nails biting wood, and now there was no sound except her breath and the creak of old heartwood holding 30 feet of life over stone. Silas stepped onto the trunk when she reached the far side. He made it 3 paces before Barrow's voice cracked again. "Hold your fire." The sheriff had climbed down to a mid-shelf of stone, level with Silas's hips. The badge, a bright coin. He stood in a narrow pocket with 2 men at his back, and every angle but one, front, covered in rock. "You take another step," he said, calm as a hanging judge, "and I put a round through your hand. The girl falls either way." Wren had flattened herself behind a root spur on the far shelf, looking back. Silas could see her eyes measuring the distance between his boot and Barrow's pistol, between the pistol and possibilities. He felt a prickle along his spine. The cottonwood swayed again. "You want the truth so bad, Sheriff," Silas called. "Come down where a man can see your eyes." The sheriff's mouth tightened, not at the insult, but at the time being lost to it. He cocked the revolver, flange catching sunlight. "This ends now. She knows things that put good men in bad light. Better a quiet burial than a loud trial." The phrase landed like a stone dropped in a well. Better a quiet burial. Men behind him shifted, as if they'd heard more than they'd meant to. Silas's heart thumped once, the way it had the morning the colt kicked the fence post, and the whole corral gave with a dry crack. Irreversible. Sudden. He could keep dancing on this log until it split, or he could change the ground. He holstered the Winchester. Barrow's eyes went flat with triumph. Wise at last. Silas took a breath that tasted like ice water and iron. "You're right about one thing," he said. "This ends now." He drew the Colt instead, slower, the old leather creaking like a throat clearing. Then he fired, not at Barrow. He put the slug into the cottonwood's underbelly right where rot had hollowed it. The trunk shivered like a struck bell. A rotten seam opened with a sound like a sigh, and then a crack racing gut-ward. The whole bridge dropped an inch, then 2. Barrow swore, stumbling against the wall to keep his balance. Silas went to his knees and gripped the trunk with both arms, feeling it go soft and live under him. "Run," he barked to Wren, and for the first time since he'd taken her in, a word left his mouth like a command and not a comfort. She ran, not far, just a whip of motion to the far ledge, and then she turned as if to bolt down the wash. But she didn't. She faced them, palms up, fingers moving too fast to read, eyes bright with something like fury. She threw the nickel locket as hard as she could. It hit the wall above Barrow with a bright ringing and fell, opened, into his boot prints. He looked down before he could help himself, and Silas saw it land face up, the photograph, the double-armed cross, and the name written in a careful hand below a woman's portrait. Eliza C. Barrow. The sheriff's jaw clenched. "Pick it up," he said to no one, to everyone. "Pick it up and end this." A deputy didn't move. Another swallowed hard. The youngest, a sandy-haired boy who'd looked away when the barn burned, made the sign of the cross. Silence spread like oil. In it, the canyon's tiny river spoke up. A quiet rush over stone. Moral choice pressed on Silas from both sides. Finish the bridge and strand the child alone with whatever came next, or hold steady and try to drag the rot another foot, bluff, and break both their necks. He chose the third thing, the thing his father had said men do when bad choices box them, make a new board. "May," he shouted back, up the goat path without looking, now. On the ridge behind them, hidden all morning under a tarp, May Fitch's old trail wagon lurched forward with a groan and the rattle of harness. She and Tomas had spent the night yoking it to a scrub oak stump, chaining the axle to a juniper, rigging a line of rawhide and rope down to the cottonwood's crown. At Silas's shout, May set the brake loose and Tomas heaved on the windlass. The rope went taut with a song like a bowstring. The cottonwood rose, not much, an inch, 2, enough to take weight off the split, enough to make room for one breath and then another. Barrow saw it happen. Rage put a high shine on his eyes. He raised his gun not at Silas now, but at the rope where it bit over the rim. "Cut the string," he said. "Let gravity do our work." "Don't," the sandy-haired boy blurted, voice cracking. "Sheriff, she's a—" He swallowed the word. "Child." Barrow's finger whitened on the trigger. Wren moved. She came to the edge of the far shelf and stood straight, dust to her ankles, hair in her eyes, and lifted her chin in a way that hurt to see. With 2 fingers, she tapped the portrait in the dust at Barrow's feet, then touched her own mouth. Not just witness, blood. The sheriff's gun wavered. Above them, a new sound rose, far off, faint at first, then gathering shape. A second posse? No. Hooves, yes, but slower. The clink of tack. That didn't hurry. Accompanied by the jangle of harness and the scrape of wheels. Law that didn't run. A federal wagon, maybe, or the circuit judge himself, late as always, but real as rain. Barrow heard it, and bared his teeth. "End it," he hissed to his men. "Now." Silas drew a bead on the pistol in the sheriff's hand, and squeezed. And a single rifle cracked from the distant ridge above the incoming wagon. The bullet smacked stone between Barrow's boots, showering him with grit. A voice carried, level as a plumb line, and twice as cold. "Any man fires in this canyon answers to me." Silas lifted his eyes to the rim. A silhouette stood there under the hard noon, broad hat, long coat, a star that wasn't county issue catching the sun. Wren's fingers fluttered a question he had no answer for. Was it salvation, or another noose wearing a different star? The cottonwood groaned, the rope screamed, and the sheriff began to raise his gun again as the new rider lifted a hand. And the canyon held its breath. The rain had stopped hours ago, but the night air still held that damp heaviness that made every sound travel farther than it should. Tobias stood in the ruined doorway of his ranch house, boots sunk in mud, eyes fixed on the ring of torchlight beyond. The flames outlined Colonel Bradley's men like specters in uniform, 60 rifles in a slow, tightening circle. Inside, Ayanna's knife was still pressed to the pale throat of Bradley's son. The young lieutenant's breathing was shallow, not from the steel at his skin, but from the weight of knowing his father was out there, and that nothing in his life had prepared him for a night like this. Bradley's voice carried across the cold air, low and tight with rage. "Release my boy, and you'll live to see the sun rise." Ayanna didn't flinch. "Your men murdered our families. You set Morrison loose on us. There is no sunrise for men like you, only judgment." Tobias kept his rifle in the crook of his arm, watching the lines of soldiers shifting nervously. He knew this kind of tension. One wrong move, and the air would split open with gunfire. He leaned toward Ayanna, voice barely a whisper. "You kill him, and Bradley's men will cut us down before you can take 2 steps." Ayanna's eyes stayed on the colonel, but her voice was steady. "Then give me another way. Tobias's mind turned fast. There was one, but it was as risky as dancing on the edge of a cliff in the dark. We trade. His son for the truth. On paper, signed and sealed by Bradley himself. A confession that would hang him in every court from here to Washington. Ayana's brow tightened. He would never. He would if the alternative is burying his son before dawn. The colonel must have sensed the shift, because his voice came again, edged with unease. Name your price. Tobias stepped forward, letting the firelight catch his face. A full written confession, every name, every order, every raid. Your seal at the bottom. You give me that, and your boy walks out alive. A murmur rippled through Bradley's men. Some looked at each other, some stared at their boots. The colonel hesitated just long enough for everyone to feel it. Do you think I'd damn myself on paper? Bradley asked. Tobias shrugged. You either damn yourself in ink, or your boy dies in the mud. Your choice, Colonel. The silence stretched. Then Bradley barked an order. A soldier brought him a field desk, paper, and a pen. The colonel's hands were steady as he wrote, but his jaw was set like iron. When he finished, he folded the pages, sealed them with his signet ring, and held them high. Send him out, and the paper is yours. Tobias glanced at Ayana. She studied Bradley's face for a long moment, then slowly eased the knife away from the lieutenant's neck. The young man's shoulders slumped, but he didn't move until Tobias nodded toward the doorway. As the boy stepped into the open, Bradley came forward with the sealed confession. They crossed paths between the lines of soldiers, father and son locking eyes in a wordless exchange that carried more weight than any bullet. When the colonel's hand closed over his boy's shoulder, Tobias took the papers. He didn't unfold them, not yet. Just holding them felt like gripping the handle of a loaded pistol. Bradley's voice was low, but it carried. If you think this will save you, you don't know the West. Paper burns, men disappear, and memories fade. Tobias smiled without humor. Maybe. But tonight, you signed your own gallows rope. The colonel's men began to pull back, but Tobias knew better than to think the danger had passed. Bradley was not the kind of man to walk away without trying to even the score. Sure enough, the colonel's hand twitched toward his holster. But before he could draw, a sharp whistle cut through the night. Ayana's signal. From the shadows, figures emerged. Federal marshals on horseback, their badges catching the torchlight. They fanned out between Bradley's line and the ranch, rifles held loose but ready. The lead marshal reined in beside Tobias, eyeing the sealed confession. We've been tracking this mess for months, he said. Looks like you just wrapped it up for us. Bradley's mouth tightened, but with marshals on both sides, and his son still trembling under his hand, he didn't make a move. You'll hang for this, the marshal told him flatly. Not for what's in the papers, though that's bad enough, but for thinking the law was yours to use like a branding iron. The colonel didn't speak again. His men led him away into the dark, the torches scattering like dying stars. When the last hoofbeats faded, the marshals turned to Tobias. We'll take this to the capital. It'll bring the whole rotten tree down. You've done more than you know. Ayana sheathed her knife and looked at Tobias. You risked everything for a bargain that could have turned against you. He shook his head. Not everything, just enough to make sure the right people lose sleep tonight. Outside, the wind had shifted, carrying the smell of wet earth and gunpowder away into the hills. The night was still dangerous, but the balance had tipped. just enough for hope to take root. And somewhere in the darkness, justice had started walking toward them. The valley never truly went quiet again. Even after the marshals rode out and the last echo of hoofbeats faded into the cottonwoods, Tobias felt the air holding its breath, as if waiting to see which way the story would turn in the telling. The girl, no longer just the silent shadow who'd come to his gate, sat on the porch rail with the satchel in her lap, the locket now hanging loose in her fingers. She didn't smile, but there was a looseness in her shoulders that hadn't been there before, a space where fear had lived too long. He knew the papers might burn, men might lie, and justice in the West could be slower than a winter thaw. But the sheriff was gone. The truth was moving under its own weight, and the girl had chosen to stand in the open rather than hide in the dark. That was something a man could build on, even in a land where fences rotted and trails disappeared under the wind. As the stars came out, hard, cold, and countless, Tobias wondered if justice was ever a place you reached, or only a road you kept riding until your legs gave out. Either way, they would ride at first light and keep riding until the trail ended.